We're happy to report that 10 DW correspondents working in Afghanistan have now been able to leave the country following its takeover by the Taliban. The correspondents entered neighboring Pakistan earlier today. This group includes DW's sole female correspondent in Afghanistan. The situation for journalists on the ground has become increasingly dangerous, with reports of intimidation and violence at the hands of the Taliban. Joined now by one of the DW correspondents, Marjana Sadat, who joins me now from the phone from Pakistan. Marjana, thank you for taking the time to speak with us. I want to start by asking you, you were able to leave Afghanistan. What are your feelings right now?
Thank you for having me on your program. As you know, there was no hope for the future anymore in Afghanistan. But on that time, I decided to be on this situation and want to speak, to write, and for portray most of today's narratives. Even it was done by secretly, but we decided to write about the betrayal of the land and to portray of the displacement of our people and our generation there, and it was for our history. So I didn't experience those dark days, and you know, the 15 years back was the best days of my life and the other women's in Afghanistan. I studied, we went to universities, we worked with the most prestigious international media, and like me, many women in various fields of works, and those days were just our golden days of our lifetime, and it's finished just 3 weeks ago when the Taliban took over the Afghanistan.
Marjana, you say the golden days of your lives basically taken away that day when the Taliban took Kabul. What were your feelings that day when you saw that was taking place?
Actually, on that day, I was outside the home, and I wanted to go and record the reports from Kabul University. I was in German department in Kabul University. My colleague called me and told me that Taliban is entered the Kabul, and you need to come to office. On the first time I came down, they came down on our block and asked the guard who is living here in this block. I was looking at them through the window of my apartment, and I just shocked because I didn't experience of the Taliban regime before. So now, as in the past, I can't freely hold my camera and take pictures and videos from the of the Kabul roads, interview with the people freely, and like me, any or other journalists as well, they cannot do their job like freely and go to roads and without any fear in Kabul.
Marjana Sadat, thank you. We're relieved to hear that you're safe and sound, and thank you again for speaking with us. The U.S. is preparing to mark the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. The terrorist strikes using hijacked airliners killed nearly 3,000 people. Events are taking place across the country. Students at this New Jersey school have installed 2,977 flags on the front lawn. That's one flag for each person killed when the jets hit the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. A 4th plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania.
The UN Development Agency has warned that Afghanistan could soon be on the brink of economic and social collapse if no effort is made to support the economy. They say that takeover by the Taliban has put more than 20 years of gains at risk, and that large parts of the country could be plunged into poverty by the middle of next year. The comments come as the international community faces off over whether to unfreeze billions of dollars of funds belonging to Afghanistan and currently held in the United States. Some say the risk of not doing so could leave millions hungry and generate new waves of refugees. But the US says it has conditions.
If a new Afghan government upholds its commitments and obligations, brings greater stability to the country and region, demonstrates real inclusion, and protects the gains of the past 2 decades, we'll work with it. But we will not do that on the basis of trust or faith alone. The Taliban seeks international legitimacy and support. Our message is simple. Any legitimacy and support will have to be earned.
But Pakistan is urging a different approach. Its foreign minister called for the assets to be unfrozen and for the international community to step in to avert a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, calling it a collective responsibility.
But what we are saying is, okay, if you're not ready for immediate economic aid or development, fine, but do not take steps that would lead to an economic collapse of Afghanistan. That will not help. That will not help anyone.
And Pakistan, for its part, has already begun sending aid to Afghanistan. The country delivered a first shipment to Kabul of 30 tons of supplies, including food, medical equipment, and medicine. The Pakistani government says deliveries will continue in the coming days, and in the next round, relief planes will land in Kandahar, Herat, and Khost provinces. But Pakistan's involvement in Afghanistan extends far beyond aid. The 9/11 terror attacks meant it was to play a pivotal role in US operations and policy in Afghanistan. A prime reason for that was Pakistan's support for the Taliban. It formed the basis of cooperation and confrontation with the United States. We'll talk about that in detail in a moment, but here's a quick summary of how that relationship has played out over the last 20 years.
In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, Pakistan's leader, General Pervez Musharraf, declared Pakistan would join the war on terror as a US ally. In return for the lifting of sanctions and billions of dollars in aid, Pakistan provided the US with a number of military airports and bases for its attack on Afghanistan, along with other logistical support. But the alliance between the two countries was always shaky, marked by distrust from both sides. Many Taliban members had been trained in religious schools in Pakistan, and fundamental Islamists still held considerable power. While helping the US militarily, Pakistan was also harboring Taliban and Al-Qaeda terrorists. In 2011, 10 years after it launched its war on terror, the US tracked down and killed the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks, Osama bin Laden. It turned out that he had been holed up in a secure compound in Pakistan. That led many in the US to question how the world's most wanted terrorist could have been hiding in plain sight in a country that was supposedly an ally. But the US too did much to draw Pakistan's anger. Continued drone strikes on Taliban targets in Pakistani territory stoked anti-US sentiment. Many Pakistanis felt they were a violation of their sovereignty, and hundreds of Pakistani civilians as well as soldiers were killed by US drones, leading to huge demonstrations. More recently, Pakistan used its influence with the Taliban to act as a mediator in peace talks between the US and the Islamists. But how frail the bond between Pakistan and the US really is became clear after the US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan made no secret of his feelings, saying, in Afghanistan they have just broken the chains of slavery. With the US mission in Afghanistan over and the Taliban now in charge, the relationship between the US and Pakistan is set to be redefined.
Joining me now for more is Michael Kugelman. He's Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Michael, welcome. Now, since taking office, US President Joe Biden hasn't yet called Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan. I wonder what that says about the state of the bilateral relationship.
Well, I think it's an indication of how this relationship is transactional. And in other words, the administration is not going to have a call between the president and Prime Minister Khan just for the sake of having the call. I think that you would get a call between Biden and Imran Khan only if there's something major to discuss, whether a new agreement, for instance, a new, say, intelligence sharing agreement to help with counterterrorism activities in Afghanistan or something like that. the Biden administration may consider Pakistan as a partner to an extent, but certainly not a close ally. And I think that the ideas that suggest that there really is no reason to have such a prestigious call, so to speak, unless there is something really major to highlight or to discuss.
And why does America view this relationship to be so transactional?
Well, I'd argue there's nothing wrong with the transactional relationship. First of all, in fact, the U.S. Has very few relationships that one would describe as strategic, which I think is the logical opposite of a transactional relationship. Certainly, the U.S. has strategic relationships with some of its closest allies, such as the U.K. and Israel and Australia. But the most of its relationships are transactional. And I think with Pakistan, there's just a lot of divergent interests, and there have been for quite some time. And you look back over the last 20 years, clearly there's a lot of disagreement when it comes, first of all, to classifying what constitutes a threat and a terrorist threat. Obviously, the U.S. looks at how Pakistan has treated terrorist organizations, terrorist groups like the Haqqani Network and Lashkar-e-Taiba. It sponsors these groups. The U.S. sees them as enemies. And the U.S. also believes, rightfully so, that Pakistan has oftentimes sheltered the very groups that the U.S. wants them to target. And I think given those levels of divergences and interests and those levels of mistrust, it's very difficult to think that there would be enough goodwill and trust to be able to forge a deep strategic partnership.
Now, with that having been said, how do you see the relationship with Pakistan shaping up now with the Taliban, a group that Pakistan has supported in the past, running Afghanistan?
Well, certainly, I think that Pakistan has clearly gained a major strategic victory in the sense that for the first time in nearly 20 years, it will have a friendly government in Kabul, so to speak, which has long been Pakistan's goal. And that entails opportunities for Pakistan to step up its role and its footprint in Afghanistan in very overt ways. And of course, it also means that it'll be very more difficult for India, which for much of the last 20 years had been arguably Afghanistan's closest partner in South Asia. But I think India's influence and its leverage in Afghanistan is really going to suffer a big blow. Now, what this means for the U.S. and Pakistan, and that remains to be seen. For quite some time, the U.S. has sought to enlist Pakistan in efforts to pressure the Taliban to do things that would conceivably help U.S. interests in Afghanistan. Most recently, that has entailed trying to get Pakistan to get the Taliban to the table for negotiations, and more recently to try to get the Taliban to stop staging violence. This worked to an extent. It also did not work to an extent. But I think that same pattern will likely continue as we move forward. But it's very hard to know at this point how the relationship will play out, because the U.S. is, for all intents and purposes, it's left Afghanistan. And I think that it feels that for its limited goals in Afghanistan right now, which entail things like getting any remaining Americans out of Afghanistan, ensuring that humanitarian assistance can get to Afghanistan, the U.S. can just engage directly with the Taliban. It doesn't need Pakistan's mediation.
Now, can I expand the question to wider U.S. engagement in the Indo-Pacific? What is the key thing we should be watching out for?
Well, if you want to talk about U.S. engagement with the Indo-Pacific, I think that this has to be framed through the lens of China and U.S.-China rivalry. And in fact, one of the main reasons why President Biden decided to leave Afghanistan was to be able to focus more attention on U.S.-China competition. So I think that we will see in the coming weeks and months efforts by the administration to build on the momentum of the Quad grouping of the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India to develop new areas of cooperation, whether that entails the pandemic or climate change or other things, and also infrastructure. I think there's going to be an effort to try to build cooperation on infrastructure, all in an effort to push back, or should I say to counterbalance, China. And I think more broadly, what we're going to see from the Biden administration is to try to build a greater global consensus to push back against China. Again, using recent developments like a new G7 initiative to develop this new infrastructure project that would entail trying to wean countries around the world away from Chinese infrastructure support. That's going to be hard to do. But I think that's the plan now. And so I think that the Biden administration is increasingly going to want to have the Afghanistan situation in the rearview mirror, even though it's going to remain engaged to an extent, particularly when you look at counterterrorism efforts. But the focus will be on other parts of Asia, particularly the East and Northeast Asia, the Indo-Pacific.
We'll leave it there for the time being, but thank you so much for joining us today, Michael Kugelman.
Thank you.